The quiet neighborhood looked peaceful the day he moved in, and that was exactly what he wanted. After years of working long shifts and dealing with stressful situations, he hoped this new place would give him some calm. The streets were lined with tall trees. The houses were close enough to feel friendly but far enough apart so people could mind their own business. He liked that. He liked things simple. He unpacked slowly during the first week. Most days he kept to himself, fixing small things around the house and learning the layout of the community. He didn't know much about the local HOA. Other than that, they handled the usual things: trash pickup rules, lawn care reminders, parking guidelines. Nothing unusual. At least that's what he thought. He first noticed her on a warm afternoon, when he was cleaning out the small storage shed behind the house. She walked up the driveway without saying hello, without even waiting for him to notice her presence. She stood there with a clipboard tucked under her arm as if she had been inspecting something. "You know," she said, pointing at the shed, "that color isn't approved by the HOA." He turned to look at her. She spoke in a flat, authoritative tone, the kind that suggested she was used to telling people what to do. He didn't argue. He simply explained that he had not painted the shed. It came that way. She gave a stiff nod, made a note on her clipboard, and walked away without another word. He shrugged it off. Maybe she was just overly passionate about neighborhood rules. Every community had someone like that, someone who wanted to keep things perfect. But as the days passed, he realized she wasn't just passionate. She was persistent to a level that felt intrusive. The next time she showed up, it was over the small pile of boxes he had placed near the garage door. He was sorting them for recycling, but before he could finish, she appeared again, pointing at the boxes like they were some kind of threat. "Those need to be broken down before leaving them out," she said. "We have standards here." He nodded politely. "I'm still working on it. I just set them down for a minute." "Even so," she said, tightening her expression, "we expect residents to follow the rules at all times." He didn't respond. She seemed to prefer talking at people instead of talking to them. Still, he tried to keep it friendly. He had no interest in making enemies with neighbors, but she didn't stop. A few days later, he noticed her walking past his house more often than before. At first he thought it might just be coincidence, but then he realized she wasn't walking for exercise. She was looking, inspecting, watching. She would slow down near his front yard, glance at the grass, look at the small renovation work he had started near the front door, and then hurry off, as if she didn't want him to catch her staring. He tried to brush it off. Maybe she was just curious about the new resident. Maybe she was checking on everyone like that. He hadn't been here long enough to know how things worked, but things changed one morning when she walked right up onto his porch again, this time holding a stack of printed notices. "These are the guidelines you need to follow," she said, handing them to him like she was serving official papers. "Some of your recent activities have been questionable." He looked through the papers. They listed basic HOA policies, most of which he was already following. The renovations he had been doing were small: replacing a door frame, fixing a loose shutter, refreshing the walkway with new stones. Nothing that required approval. "I'm not doing anything outside the rules," he said calmly. She crossed her arms. "That depends on how you interpret the rules." She left before he could respond at that point. He began to understand why some neighbors spoke in lowered voices when she passed by. They weren't afraid of her, they were tired of her. It was clear she had become the self-appointed enforcer of everything she believed should be controlled. Even so, he didn't want to assume anything rude about her. Maybe she didn't realize how she came across. Maybe she thought she was genuinely helping the community. So he kept being polite, even when she wasn't. But then she started leaving notes. They weren't aggressive, but they were passive-aggressive. He found them tucked into the edges of his doorframe, taped to his mailbox, even stuck onto his car windshield. Most of them said things like, "Please remember to follow HOA standards." Even when nothing was wrong, one note mentioned that his front door camera faced the sidewalk too directly, which made no sense because every other house had one just like it. Another note said that his recycling bin was slightly angled wrong, which made him wonder how much time she spent observing things that were not her concern. He still didn't react. Getting upset wouldn't help. And besides, he wasn't the kind of person who escalated conflict unless he had to. But the moment that pushed things from annoying to unsettling came on a quiet weekend morning. He was sitting in his living room, reading when he heard footsteps on the porch. He sat still for a moment, thinking maybe it was a delivery. But when he looked out the window, he saw her again, this time leaning forward, peering through the narrow window beside his door. She wasn't knocking. She wasn't calling out. She was simply looking inside. He opened the door gently. She jumped slightly, then quickly straightened her posture. "Is there something I can help you with?" he asked. "Oh," she said, pretending surprise. "I didn't know you were home. I was checking to see if you received the latest HOA reminders." He kept his voice calm. "You can just leave them in the mailbox. You don't have to look inside the house." Her smile tightened. "I wasn't looking inside. I was just making sure you hadn't missed anything." He didn't argue with her. But her behavior was beginning to feel less like concern and more like surveillance. Over the next week, she became even more involved. She stopped neighbors who tried to visit him and asked them why they were there. She told another resident that he was being monitored for possible violations. None of it made sense. He hadn't done anything wrong. While he kept his cool on the outside, he began making quiet notes of everything that happened. Dates, times, comments, actions. Not because he wanted trouble, but because he knew that sometimes small things could build into bigger problems if left ignored. He didn't want conflict, but he wasn't the type to let someone walk over him either. Still, he hoped it would calm down. He hoped she would lose interest and focus on something else. He hoped moving here would actually give him the peace he was looking for, but instead, she became more determined. One afternoon, as he was planting a few flowers near the walkway, she approached yet again. This time she didn't bother hiding her disapproval. "Are those approved plants?" she asked, looking directly at the flower tray. "They're just basic garden flowers," he replied. "I don't think there's a rule against them." "There are guidelines on uniformity," she said sharply. "People can't plant whatever they want." He raised an eyebrow. "Then why does every house on this street have different plants?" "That's not the point," she snapped, then immediately softened her voice when she realized she sounded too harsh. "I just want to make sure the neighborhood stays consistent." He didn't answer. He simply picked up the tray and walked toward the garden bed. She stood there for a moment, staring as if expecting him to stop. When he didn't, she turned and walked away, muttering under her breath at this point. It was clear she wasn't following rules. She was making up her own. The strangest part was that she never introduced herself properly. She never said her name, though everyone around casually referred to her as the one person you didn't want to deal with. He began hearing quiet stories from neighbors, how she had scolded someone for leaving a garden hose out too long, how she had reprimanded a teenager for skateboarding in his own driveway, how she had once threatened to fine a family for hanging holiday lights too early, but she had taken a particular interest in him. Maybe because he was new. Maybe because she felt she had more control over newcomers. Maybe because he didn't respond the way she wanted. Whatever the reason, she seemed determined to test boundaries, and he had a feeling she wasn't done. The more she watched him, the more she talked at him, and the more she seemed to appear during the most random moments, the clearer it became that this was about more than rules. This was about control, but he wasn't intimidated. He had dealt with far worse situations in his career. Compared to those, this was just an inconvenience. Still, he kept notes. He kept record of every interaction. Not because he expected anything serious to happen, but because he knew that people who pushed boundaries rarely stopped on their own. He hoped she wouldn't cross a line. He hoped she would eventually back off. But some part of him, deep down, knew she was the kind of person who believed. She had more authority than she actually did, and people like that often went too far. He just didn't know yet how far she was willing to go, and he had no idea that everything was about to take a much bigger turn than he ever expected. The days after the porch incident felt strange. He carried on with his usual routine, trying to ignore the feeling of eyes on him, but something in the air had changed. The neighbor with the clipboard, who seemed to drift around the community like a self-appointed guard, was becoming harder to ignore. Each time he looked up from his yard work, or stepped out to grab a package. He caught brief glimpses of her at the corner of the street or passing by a little too slowly, as if she were trying not to look suspicious while doing something that already was. He tried not to let it bother him, but her presence followed him like a shadow. He wasn't someone easily rattled, but he could sense when someone's curiosity crossed a line, and she had crossed several already. Still, he told himself it was manageable. He had dealt with pushy people before. Neighbors who complained, folks who inserted themselves into situations they didn't understand. People with strong opinions, and no filter. None of that was new to him. What mattered was staying calm, keeping things civil, and hoping she would eventually get tired of monitoring his every move. But instead of getting tired, she seemed to grow more energized. One morning, as he stepped outside to water the plants, he heard her voice rise in the distance. She was talking to another neighbor, a man who was trying to unload groceries from his car. Her tone was sharp, like she was lecturing him. "You can't leave your car in the street like this," she said. "Not even for a minute." The man gave a tired sigh. "I'm just carrying in the bags. I'll move it in a moment." "Doesn't matter," she insisted. "We have rules." "Rules are rules." Didn't mean to stare, but she glanced over and caught his eye. Her expression shifted quickly, as if she wondered how much he had heard. She straightened her posture, smoothed her shirt, and then gave the man one last warning before walking away. He turned back to his plants, pretending not to think much of it, but her behavior was becoming impossible to ignore. She wasn't supervising. She was hunting, watching people not because she cared about rules, but because she enjoyed enforcing them. Later that afternoon, while he was hauling a bag of soil to the backyard, he heard footsteps crunching across his front lawn. He turned around and wasn't surprised at all to see her standing there again. "Those stones you're using for your walkway," she said, pointing. "I'm not sure they match the approved materials." He set down the bag of soil. "They're the same kind other houses on this street use." "That may be," she said, flicking her eyes toward his boots. "But every house needs to follow the proper submission process. I'm not doing a major renovation. I'm just lining the walkway." She pursed her lips. "Still needs approval." He wondered if she actually believed that, or if she simply wanted to create new rules every time she saw something she disliked. He debated arguing, but something told him it would only encourage her. Instead, he nodded politely. "I'll look into it." She sniffed like she didn't quite believe him, then stared at the stones for a second longer before turning and walking away. For a normal neighbor, that would have been the end of it. But for her, it was just warm up. The next morning, he found another notice taped to his door. This one was printed in bold letters with the HOA logo at the top. But even without reading it closely, he could tell it wasn't official. The alignment was off. The font didn't match the previous notices. And the signature at the bottom simply read, "Community Oversight Coordinator," a title he had never heard of. The notice warned him about potential noncompliance with property guidelines and suggested he schedule a home inspection. He shook his head and almost laughed. A home inspection? For planting flowers and fixing stones? He folded the notice and set it aside, knowing it didn't deserve serious attention. But the fact that she was now creating fake documents was unsettling. He walked to the mailbox to send out a couple of bills. On his way back, he noticed one of the neighbors, an older woman, watering her roses. She looked up, glanced down the street nervous, then stepped closer. "Watch out," she whispered in a low voice. "She's been asking questions." He paused. "Questions about what?" "About you." The woman glanced around again, lowering her voice even more. "She came by yesterday asking if I'd seen you doing anything unusual." I told her no. Of course not. Then she asked if I thought you were planning something. He raised an eyebrow. "Planning what?" "That's the thing." She didn't say. The woman gave a small, sympathetic shrug. "Don't take it personally. She has a habit of creating problems when there aren't any." He thanked her and wished her a good day, but as he walked back toward the house, he felt a twinge of irritation. It was one thing for her to bother him. It was another for her to spread rumors. He couldn't understand her obsession. He kept to himself. He didn't break rules. He didn't cause trouble. Why was she so fixated? The answer came later that day. He was sitting on the front porch reading when he saw her walking down the street, her clipboard in hand, her steps brisk with purpose. She stopped at a house 2 doors down and started taking pictures. Not of anything unusual, just of the front yard, the porch light, the mailbox from the porch. He could hear the homeowner call out, "Can I help you?" She didn't even look embarrassed. "Just checking for compliance," she said. The homeowner frowned. "No one asked you to do that. We all have responsibilities to the community," she replied. Without missing a beat, he watched the exchange carefully, trying to understand her mindset. She truly believed she was the protector of the neighborhood, the enforcer, the authority. Except she wasn't any of those things. As the day went on, he noticed her circling back to his street again and again. Sometimes she pretended to pick up trash. Sometimes she paused to tie her shoe. Sometimes she pretended to read her clipboard, while clearly looking at his house. It was like she had nothing else to do. By sunset, he had counted 5 walk-bys. None of them accidental. That night, while he sat inside with the lights low, he saw her silhouette pass his window once again. This time, she slowed her pace so much, he could see the outline of her head turning toward the house. He stayed quiet. No sudden movements. He simply watched. Her shadow stayed lingering for a moment. Before fading into the distance, he took a deep breath and leaned back in his chair. Something was building. He could feel it. The next day, decided to do something different. Listen. He started paying attention to the subtle details of her behavior. The rhythm of her patrols. The moments she paused. The direction she glanced. It became clear that she wasn't just checking his property, she was trying to gather something. But what? Late in the afternoon, while he was cleaning his patio, he overheard her again. This time talking to a couple who were taking out the trash. "He's new," she said. "And new people sometimes try to bend the rules. We need to stay alert." The couple didn't respond. They gave the polite nod that people often give when they want to end a conversation without causing offense. She didn't take the hint. "I've seen some things around his place. Things that don't look right." He paused, listening closely. She hadn't seen anything wrong. There was nothing to see. But she spoke as if she had uncovered some deep secret. The couple quickly excused themselves and went back inside. Leaving her standing alone with her clipboard, she looked around, as if making sure no one else was listening, then walked down the sidewalk toward his home. He stood up, wiping off his hands, and met her on the path. "Something you need?" he asked. She blinked, clearly startled to find him waiting. Her grip tightened on the clipboard. "Oh, I was just checking if everything was in order," she said, forcing a smile. "There have been complaints." He kept his tone calm. "Complaints from who?" "That's confidential," she replied quickly. "Is it?" he asked. For a moment she faltered. Her eyes shifted. Her posture stiffened. She wasn't used to being questioned. She was used to people nodding and avoiding confrontation. "I'm only doing my job," she finally said. He gave a slow nod. "Whose job is that?" She stared at him, caught between irritation and uncertainty. But instead of answering, she turned around and walked away. He watched her go. This wasn't going to end on its own. She had invested too much time in her self-assigned mission. She was escalating step by step. That evening, as he cooked dinner, he noticed something odd on his security camera. Not suspicious enough to be dangerous, but strange enough to make him pay attention. She had paused at his driveway again, this time standing closer than usual. She wasn't looking at his yard, she was looking at the side of the house, where a small storage door was slightly misaligned. The latch had been loose lately. He had planned to fix it but hadn't gotten to it yet. On the video, she leaned in, examined the door, then stepped back and looked around. As if trying to assess whether anyone was watching, he watched the footage twice. Nothing criminal. Nothing harmful. But it was concerning. Someone who felt entitled enough to inspect the side of his house might feel entitled to inspect the inside. He didn't want to jump to conclusions. But something deep down told him that she wasn't just nosy. She was looking for a reason. A justification. An excuse, and people like her often created excuses when they couldn't find real ones. He pondered the footage long after the sound of sizzling food filled the kitchen. She was inching closer to crossing a line, and he could sense it. Still, he let the night pass quietly. No confrontation. No decisions made in frustration, but he knew something was coming. And when people push and push without being stopped, they often take one step too far. He just didn't expect that step to come so soon, or so boldly, or so completely uninvited. The morning started out quiet, the kind of peaceful stillness he had hoped this neighborhood would always have. Birds were chirping, the air was cool, and for once, he didn't see her outside doing her usual slow walk past his driveway. He thought maybe she had taken the hint, or maybe she finally found something else to focus on. For a moment, he let himself believe things were settling down. He brewed his coffee, stepped out to sit on the back patio, and let the calmness wash over him. It felt good to breathe without wondering who was watching. He planned to spend the day fixing the loose latch on the side door, then maybe take a drive out of town. Anything to enjoy a normal day, but just when he started to relax, something felt off. He noticed the side gate was slightly open. He didn't remember leaving it that way. He always closed it behind him, even if he planned to return in a minute. It was a habit he didn't break, a habit he trusted. He stood, walked toward it, and looked more closely. The latch wasn't broken. The wood didn't look damaged, but the gate wasn't fully shut. He closed it with a soft click, telling himself it could have been the wind. But deep down, he knew the wind didn't open latches. He shook off the thought and went back inside. No reason to assume anything yet. As the morning went on, he grabbed his tools and decided to take care of the side door. The latch had been bothering him for a week. Better to fix it now than keep putting it off. He walked around the side of the house, carrying a small toolbox. The area was narrow and shaded, with the small door that led into a storage section beside the kitchen wall. But when he reached the door, he stopped. The latch wasn't just loose. Noette was hanging open. He leaned closer, inspecting it. The screws weren't stripped or worn. They were twisted at odd angles, like someone had tried to force the latch without knowing how to do it properly. He stared at it. For a moment, then he checked the door handle. It moved. He frowned. He knew he had locked it the previous night. He remembered double-checking it before going to bed. He always checked the doors. He opened the door just an inch, enough to peek inside. Nothing seemed missing or out of place, just boxes, tools, and gardening supplies. Still, he didn't like the feeling creeping up his spine. Someone had tampered with it. Not accidentally. Not randomly. On purpose. He didn't call anyone yet. There was no real evidence of wrongdoing, but he made a mental note. Another piece to the growing puzzle. He stepped away from the door, closing it again, and pulled out his phone to check the camera footage from the night before. He hadn't reviewed it since the clip of her, inspecting the side of the house. He sat on the porch steps, played the feed. Nothing unusual in the early hours, but then, near sunset the previous evening, he saw a familiar figure walking by again. She paused, looked around, then stepped toward the side yard as though she were checking something. The camera angle wasn't perfect for that spot, but he caught the side of her shoulder, her hand. The clipboard tucked under her arm. He watched as she walked into the narrow passage beside the house. Out of frame for several seconds, when she reappeared, she looked frustrated, like she had expected to find something and hadn't. He paused the footage. His jaw tightened. She had gone to the side door. That explained the latch, the screws, the angle. He set down his phone and took a slow breath. She had crossed onto his property fully, intentionally. That alone was enough to report. But he didn't want to escalate things yet. He needed to handle this with a calm head. Still, the unease didn't leave him. He kept imagining her stepping into the narrow walkway, looking around, trying the door, maybe pushing a little harder each time. He didn't understand what she hoped to find. But it was clear she was trying to discover something. The day passed quietly after that, with no more surprises. He fixed the latch, tightened the screws, and reinforced the door from the inside just to be safe. Then he organized the storage room, making sure nothing had been moved or disturbed. By late afternoon, he felt confident he had everything under control. He didn't see her at all. Not once. Which, in some ways, made him more suspicious. The sun was beginning to set when he finally decided to go for a drive just to clear his head. He grabbed his keys, turned off the lights, and headed toward the front door. But before he could open it, he heard a soft tap. Not on the door, on the window. He froze for half a second, then slowly walked over to the blinds and looked. Through a narrow slit, she was standing on his porch, clipboard in hand, looking straight at the door. He closed his eyes for a moment, exhaled steadily, then opened the door. She jerked slightly, not expecting him to appear so quickly. "Evening," he said. She straightened, clearing her throat. "I need to talk to you about something important." "What is it?" "There have been concerns raised," she said, emphasizing the word as if it carried great weight, "about unusual activity around your property." He stared at her. "Unusual activity that you created?" Her eyes widened. "Excuse me?" "I saw you on my camera," he said calmly. "On the side of my house?" "Trying the door." She inhaled sharply, as if offended. "I was doing my duty as a community board member. You're not allowed to touch my property." "I can when there are suspicions," she snapped. "What suspicions?" "That's not your concern," she said, her voice rising, but her confidence faltering. He took a step outside, keeping his voice steady. "It is absolutely my concern." She stiffened, gripping the clipboard so tightly her knuckles turned pale. "I am trying to protect this neighborhood," she said, "and I need to make sure everything inside your home follows community standards." He blinked. "Inside my home?" "Yes," she said, without hesitation, as if the idea made perfect sense to her. "If necessary?" He stared at her in disbelief. "That's not how anything works." She lifted her chin. "I know the rules better than anyone here. If I believe something is wrong, I have the authority to check." "No," he said firmly. "You don't." Her face flushed. She wasn't used to being told no. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You're hiding something," she whispered. "I can tell." He felt the air shift. This wasn't just nosy behavior anymore. This was obsession. "Good night," he said. Stepping back inside and closing the door before she could react, she knocked again. Harder. He ignored it. Eventually, after several restless seconds, her footsteps faded off the porch. He watched her walk down the driveway through the peephole. She turned back twice, as if she wanted to come back, but didn't have an excuse. When she disappeared from view, he locked the door and let out a breath he didn't know he had been holding. It wasn't over. He knew that now. He checked the camera feed again before going to bed. Around midnight, he saw her walking by the street, not close enough to his home to trespass, but close enough to watch, and she did watch. She slowed down in front of his house, staring up at the dark windows. Then she took out her phone and snapped a picture of what? He had no idea, but her expression was clear. She believed. She had found something, or she believed she would. Soon he turned off the monitor and wrapped his thoughts into a quiet decision. Next time she crossed a line, he'd have to act, because she wasn't going to stop on her own. She had already convinced herself she had. Authority? It was only a matter of time before she tested just how far she could push it, and the day she crossed into the house itself was a day he hoped would never come. But he could feel it. He could sense it. She was getting closer to that line, much closer than she should, closer than anyone had any right to get. And when that moment finally came, everything would change. Here is part 4, written in simple, natural, human-centric storytelling, as requested. No headings, no restricted names, and no YouTube policy violating content. The minutes after the break-in felt heavier than anything the officer had dealt with in years. Even though he had walked into chaos plenty of times during his job, this one carried a different weight. This was his home, his private space, the one place he expected to feel calm and separated from everything he dealt with at work. To find someone standing in the middle of his living room, acting like she belonged there, had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. He stood near the entryway, steadying his breathing while keeping his eyes on the woman who had caused all the trouble. She paced back and forth near the sofa, arms crossed tightly, cheeks flushed with frustration. She muttered things under her breath, as if she were trying to convince herself she hadn't done anything wrong. But every now and then, she glanced at the officer with a look that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite fear. It was more like confusion, like she still couldn't understand why this situation wasn't going her way. He didn't want things to escalate. His job taught him how quickly problems grew when people didn't slow down. But he also knew there was no excuse for what she did, and pretending it wasn't serious would only encourage her to push further next time. "I've already called the station," he said calmly. "They're sending a team over. We're going to handle this the right way." She spun toward him like she couldn't believe what she heard. "You didn't have to call anyone," she said, waving her hands dramatically. "This is just a misunderstanding. I told you I'm part of the association. We have rules. I was checking on your place. That's all." He shook his head. "You don't get to come inside someone's home without permission. Not for any reason. Not even if you think you're helping. You crossed the line." She opened her mouth to argue again, but he raised his hand gently. "Let's just wait. They'll talk to you. You'll get a chance to explain everything." But she didn't want to wait. That much was clear. She tapped her foot, paced more, and even walked toward the windows as if thinking about leaving. I had to step in front of the doorway to make sure she stayed put. "Please don't make this harder," he said. "Just stay where you are." She huffed loudly. "I don't understand why you're making such a big deal about this. People leave doors open all the time. I was just trying to keep the neighborhood safe." He didn't argue. There was nothing to argue about. Her story shifted each time she spoke, bending to whatever angle she thought would make her seem right. The sound of tires on the street outside broke the silence. A patrol car pulled in front of the house, followed by another. 2 officers stepped out, talking quietly as they approached the front door. The officer opened it for them and stood back so they could enter. The woman stiffened when she saw the uniforms. She clutched her hands together, almost wringing them. Her eyes darted between him and the 2 newcomers. One of the officers, a calm-spoken man he had worked with before, gave a small nod of recognition. "You all right?" he asked quietly. "Yeah," he said. "But she entered the house without permission. I came home and found her inside. She went through my things. I didn't confront her physically. I just kept her here and waited." The visiting officers turned toward the woman. "Ma'am," one of them said in a respectful voice, "can you tell us what happened?" She immediately launched into one of her versions of the story. She spoke rapidly, adding details that hadn't existed 30 minutes earlier, describing the open door as a clear emergency, claiming she had every right to inspect homes connected to the association, insisting she was only trying to help. The officers listened patiently, letting her finish without interruption. She finally stopped to catch her breath. They glanced at one another. Then one of them asked, "Do you have any permission slips or documents showing that the association allows you to enter residents' homes?" "Well, not written permission. But everyone knows that unsafe homes affect the whole area. I was doing my part to keep the neighborhood in order. It doesn't count as permission," the officer replied gently. "You need clear approval from the homeowner. Without it, entering someone's house is trespassing." She opened her mouth again, but the words seemed stuck. Her confidence faded the longer the officer spoke to her. Reality was slowly sinking in. The officer who had arrived first looked toward the homeowner. "Do you have evidence of her being inside without consent?" He nodded. "I have security footage outside the house showing her coming in, and she was standing right inside when I got home. The place isn't damaged, but she went through some drawers." The officers asked for the footage, and he showed them the clip on his phone. They watched carefully, exchanging small nods as they confirmed the details. When they were done, they approached the woman again. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us," one of them said. Her eyes widened. "Wait, what? Why? I didn't do anything wrong." "He's exaggerating. Standard procedure," the officer explained. "We need to document the incident properly. You'll be able to speak to someone at the station and explain your side. But entering someone's home without permission is serious." She shook her head, taking a step back. "This is ridiculous. I'm part of the community board. I'm not a criminal." "We understand," the officer said calmly, "but the law still applies." The woman looked desperately around the room as if searching for something to cling to. Her eyes passed over the family photos on the shelf, the untouched coffee cup near the sink, the officer himself. But nothing in the room could help her now. Finally, with her shoulders sinking, she let out a shaky breath. "This is so unfair," she whispered. The officers guided her toward the door. She didn't fight them. She only kept murmuring about misunderstanding after misunderstanding. The officer watched quietly, not out of satisfaction, but out of necessity. He had learned long ago that some people didn't understand boundaries until they collided with consequences. Outside, few neighbors had gathered at the end of their driveways, drawn by the presence of the patrol cars. Some whispered, others simply stared with wide eyes. The neighborhood had known the woman for a long time. It witnessed her loud complaints, her habit of inserting herself into matters that didn't concern her, her eagerness to enforce rules no one asked her to enforce. But seeing her escorted by officers, that was new. The woman looked around at the small crowd, her face burning with embarrassment. She tried to speak to them, tried to convince someone she was the victim here, but none of them approached her. One whispered to another, "I knew she'd take it too far someday." Another shook their head. He tried to be patient with her. Everyone saw it. As the officers gently placed the woman in the patrol car, the homeowner stood near his porch, letting the cool air settle around him. The chaos of the last hour was finally easing. His heartbeat slowed, and a long breath escaped him. One of the officers walked back toward him. "We'll take her in and file the report. Do you want to press charges?" He hesitated. His job had put him face to face with all kinds of situations, including people who made bad choices without fully understanding the consequences. But this wasn't a small mistake. She had crossed a boundary that shouldn't be crossed. "Yes," he said quietly. "I want to move forward with it. She's been pushing limits for a while. Maybe this will help her understand she can't treat people like this." The officer nodded. "We understand. We'll take care of everything." As the patrol cars slowly rolled down the street, the small group of neighbors began to disperse. A few gave him sympathetic looks. One walked over and simply said, "Sorry you had to deal with all that." "Thanks," he replied with a tired smile. "I'm just glad nobody got hurt." He stepped back into his house and closed the door gently behind him. The quiet felt strange after everything that had happened, but also comforting. His home was finally his again. The lights were still on, and the faint smell of coffee lingered from that morning. He walked through each room one by one, making sure nothing else had been touched. Everything was mostly the same, just drawers shifted, a few items moved, nothing stolen. But the feeling of someone being in his private space lingered. It wasn't anger he felt now, but something like relief mixed with exhaustion. At least it was over. At least someone had finally stepped in and drawn a clear line. He took out his phone, sent a quick message to the station, confirming he'd come by later to finalize the report, then placed the phone on the counter and leaned back against it. For the first time that day, he let himself slow down. And though the day had been stressful, he knew one thing for certain. This moment, this breathing space, was the beginning of the end of the trouble she had caused for so long. The hours after. The patrol cars left felt strangely quiet, almost too calm compared to the whirlwind that had happened earlier. The officer stayed inside his house, walking from room to room, not because he needed to check anything, but because he needed to feel like he was reclaiming his space. The air felt lighter now. The house finally felt like it belonged to him again. Later that evening, he made himself a simple dinner, something warm and grounding. He didn't turn on the TV, he didn't put on music, he just sat at the table letting his mind settle. The day had been exhausting, but in a way, it also felt like a turning point. For the first time since he moved into the neighborhood, he felt like the situation with the woman from the association was shifting. All the small things she had done, the warnings, the constant watching, the sudden visits finally had consequences. The next morning, he woke up earlier than usual. His body still felt heavy, but his mind was clearer. Made coffee and stepped outside to breathe the fresh air. The sun had just started to rise, casting soft light over the neighborhood. It looked peaceful again. As he stood on the porch, he noticed a few neighbors walking their dogs or grabbing their morning papers. Some waved. Others hesitated, as if unsure whether to approach him. After everything that had happened the day before, people were still processing it. One neighbor, A quiet older man from across the street slowly approached with his small dog trotting beside him. "Morning," he said. "Morning," the officer replied. The neighbor shifted awkwardly. "Heard what happened yesterday?" "Word spreads fast around here." "I guess it does," the officer said with a light sigh. The man nodded. "She's been bothering folks for a long time."
Yeah. You just happened to be the one she pushed too far.
"I'm sorry it had to be you, but thank you for handling it the right way." The officer gave him a small smile. "I didn't want things to get out of hand, but I couldn't ignore it either." "Well, I hope things calm down for you now," the man said before continuing down the sidewalk. The officer watched him go, feeling a little more at peace. The neighborhood wasn't perfect, but it wasn't unfriendly either. Most people here were good people, just trying to live quietly. A little later, he grabbed his keys and drove to the station to finish the paperwork. The building felt familiar and steady, like the one place where everything made sense. He walked through the halls, said hello to a few coworkers, and sat down with another officer to complete the report. They went through details carefully: what time he arrived home, how he found her inside, what she said, what evidence he had. He answered everything calmly. He had replayed the events in his head so many times already that the words came out naturally. When the report was done, the officer handling the case said, "We'll keep you updated. She'll have to go through the usual process. There'll be a hearing eventually. But for now, you did everything right." He nodded, grateful for the support. Even though he worked in law enforcement, being involved in a case personally always felt different. He was used to helping other people with their problems, not being the center of the situation. When he returned home, the neighborhood looked even more normal than before. Kids were playing scooters on the sidewalks. Someone was mowing their lawn. A delivery truck stopped at a house down the street. The everyday noise was comforting. A few hours passed quietly until there was a knock at his door. He paused, wondering who it could be. When he opened it, he found 2 members of the association's board standing there. They looked uneasy, clutching folders and clipboards like shields. "Hello," the first board member said nervously. "Do you have a moment?" "Sure," the officer replied. The 2 stepped forward a bit, not entering but standing close enough to speak quietly. "We wanted to talk to you about yesterday's incident," the second board member said. "We want to make it absolutely clear that we didn't approve of her actions. She acted alone. The association never gives permission to enter anyone's home, and we're deeply sorry for what she put you through." The officer appreciated the effort. He nodded politely. "I understand. I never thought the board asked her to do that, but I appreciate you saying it." The first board member let out a tired breath. "She's caused problems before, nothing at this level, but enough that we should have addressed it sooner. We let her position get to her head. That was our mistake. We've officially removed her from the board," the second added quickly. "Her access to all association resources has been taken away, and we'll be sending notices to the neighborhood explaining that the board does not tolerate overstepping boundaries." The officer nodded again. "It's good to hear you're taking it seriously," the first said, then hesitated. "And if you ever feel like attending meetings or giving input, we'd be happy to have someone level-headed like you." Gave a polite smile. "Maybe someday. For now, I just want some quiet." The board members chuckled softly, understanding. After a few final apologies, they left. He closed the door, feeling another layer of tension leave his shoulders. The next few days passed more peacefully than any he had experienced since moving in. Not a single unexpected visit. No warnings taped to his door. No one sneaking around taking photos of his lawn. It was almost amazing how quickly the neighborhood changed without her constant interference. People began approaching him more often, not out of fear or curiosity, but out of relief. Some offered small apologies for not stepping in earlier. Others simply said they were glad things were finally resolved. A few even offered to help fix the broken door latch or bring dinner. It made him realize something. Even though the woman from the association had given the place a bad reputation, the neighborhood itself wasn't the problem. The people living here cared about one another. They just hadn't known how to stop her from pushing too far. One afternoon, he decided to repair the door latch himself. The warm weather made it a good day for simple chores. As he worked, a couple of neighbors came over to chat casually. They talked about weekend plans, yard improvements, and local events. Nothing stressful, just normal, easygoing conversation. When he finished fixing the latch, he stepped back and tested the door a few times. It closed perfectly now. No more gaps. No more unexpected visitors slipping in through a loose hinge. He felt something settle in him, a sense of closure. That evening, he sat on his porch with a glass of iced tea, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood. A gentle breeze moved through the trees. Someone was grilling down the street. Laughter carried from a backyard gathering. For the first time since moving in, he felt like he belonged. He thought about the woman, wondering how she was feeling now. He didn't wish her harm. He hoped she would take this experience as a chance to rethink how she treated people. Sometimes the only way people change is when they finally face the consequences they avoided for too long. He hoped she learned something from it as the sun dipped below the rooftops and the sky shifted to soft shades of orange. He knew the worst was behind him. The chaos, the frustration, the constant pressure of dealing with her gone. He finally had the peaceful home he wanted, in the neighborhood. Now free from the tension she created, slowly settled back into the warm, friendly place it was meant to be. In the days that followed, he found himself more relaxed than he'd been in a long time. He enjoyed his mornings again. He chatted with neighbors during his walks. He even started small improvements around the house, things he had put off because of the constant stress. One weekend, he hosted a small gathering on his porch. A few neighbors brought drinks and snacks, and they all talked comfortably, laughing about small things, planning future get-togethers. It felt good, simple, real, human. At one point, a neighbor raised their cup and said with a smile, "Here's to calmer days." Everyone cheered lightly, and the officer couldn't help but smile. Calmer days. That was all he ever wanted. And now, finally, he had them.